Okay, so for this investigation, we're going to be talking about soil and how rocks get glued together. So we're looking at basin, sedimentation, compaction, ecosystems, matrix, soil, precipitate, and sedimentary rocks for our vocabulary words. We did a lab, and in that lab, it was a seawater investigation, so we investigated how limestone was created, and we needed large bodies of water, and we kind of then added some chemicals, some calcium hydroxide to that, and then we added some carbon dioxide to replicate respiration and animals living in that. And when we get these chemicals mixed together, it gives us a key ingredient for making limestone, which would be our calcite or calcium carbonate. For the lab, we poured some water in, we blew some bubbles in it, and we took some observations before blowing bubbles in there, right after blowing bubbles, and after it sits. And then the next day when we came back, we noticed that there was a white precipitate at the bottom, and after letting it dry overnight, it was this harder white powder that had evaporated out and dried in the bottom of the cup, or the water evaporated out and then the powder was left behind in the cup. So we can kind of see, what happened at each stage of this, and a couple of the questions that went along with this lab. So we have, the purpose of the control cup. We can kind of use that as a comparison, a way to see what the difference was between adding carbon dioxide and respiration to the cup and not. Okay, and when we then did the acid test on that precipitate, because we are checking to see if it is like a limestone, which does react with the acid. It did fizz, so it does have calcium carbonate in it. We also tested some seashells, some seaweed, some leaves, some wood, and we really just kind of tried to narrow down these things that we would find in large bodies of water to see what reacted and what didn't react with the acid. And we see that it was the seashells and the precipitate that were the main things that reacted to the acids. As we were going through that lab, we had the water, and it kind of just giving us the little chemical breakdown of the different substances we were working with for the lab. So the calcium hydroxide, carbon dioxide, calcium carbonate. Okay, we mixed them together. We added some breath to it by blowing bubbles into it, some CO2. We get a chemical reaction that takes place. Okay, so when the calcium hydroxide comes in contact with the carbon dioxide, this chemical reaction takes place, and it produces calcium carbonate and a little bit of water. And we can kind of see here from the way this chemical formula is set up, all of the individual atoms here that we started with and ions are the same on the other side as well. So we start off with 2 oxygens, we end up with, 4 oxygens, and we end up with 4 oxygens on the other side. 1 calcium, 1 calcium, 1 carbon, 1 carbon, 2 hydrogens, 2 hydrogens. So everything gets balanced out on the other side. And we have, kind of the explanation of what happened, and the main thing here is that the calcium carbonate molecule does not dissolve in water, so it stays as a solid, and that's why it sinks to the bottom, and it gets then mixed in with the rock layer at the bottom of that large body of water, which is going to turn into limestone. And we kind of take a look at how these things happen, focusing on the sedimentary rocks. We can kind of see that white precipitate sinking to the bottom. We're going to get marine life. Okay, so that's fish and other animals that are going to be living in large bodies of water that we would get fossils of, and we can kind of see how that builds up and then would eventually get into a rock layer. We also talked about some of the other types of rocks, sandstone. Okay, and when we look at sandstone, we're looking at desert and beach areas, and we're kind of taking note that we're going to glue together those sand particles with a matrix. And as we're going to glue together those sand particles with a matrix, we're looking at the sand that's kind of loose, and then after it kind of gets packed down lower under the earth, it kind of closes up a lot of those gaps and pushes them closer together, and then we get something like a matrix, or in our class we used a sodium silicate, to glue those rocks or sand and sediment together to then eventually turn it into a rock where there are very little gaps in here and they're kind of glued together. And I pointed out in class, and we'll keep reiterating, when we looked at the pieces of sandstone under a magnifying glass, we can tell that it just looks like pieces of sand pressed together, because that's what sandstone literally is, pieces of sand pressed together. And the last type of rock that we looked at in the sedimentary group is shale. Shale is going to form in swamp, wetland, forest areas. We're going to have a lot of plant life. Shale is like a mudstone. Mud packs up over time, and the water gets squeezed out, and it dries out and hardens into a rock. So that's how we look at shale, as a essentially dried out mud.